Are we ready to launch back in? Okay. Hopefully you all had a good lunch. So I thought after lunch we would start with reviewing terminology. There's a lot of different terms that I've used this morning. Some of them may not be very clear in your head, and so I'm hoping that through this little exercise they will get clarified. And if they don't, please ask. So we have water quality standards, beneficial uses, water quality criteria, water quality objectives, drinking water standards, numeric thresholds, assessment thresholds, and water quality goals. So I'm going to go through each of these and clarify what they mean for you. So to recap, water quality standards come from, that definition comes from the Federal Clean Water Act. Federal Clean Water Act is for navigable waters and their tributaries. And it's aspects of state or federal law that designate uses of water to be protected and water quality criteria to protect those uses. US EPA also considers anti-degradation policies to be part of water quality standards and requires every delegated entity, whether it be a state or a tribe, that operates under the Clean Water Act to have an anti-degradation policy, which we'll cover at the end of the class. Beneficial uses, California term. These are the uses of water to be protected against degradation. Porter Cologne Act provides for them. They are the same thing as criteria in the Federal Clean Water Act. We find beneficial use designations in our water quality control plans, including the basin plans done by each of the regional water boards. We designate beneficial uses for our groundwaters and our surface waters to be protected. The discharge of waste is not a beneficial use and cannot occur to the detriment of beneficial uses under Porter Cologne. Yes?
Sometimes I hear the word designated use.
Designated use is the federal term.
Okay.
Under the Clean Water Act, the California term is beneficial use. So, good clarification. Means the same thing. Okay, water quality criteria. This is a Clean Water Act term. Limits for constituents or characteristics of water to protect specific uses, those designated uses. But there are two types, and this is where people get often confused. There are those criteria that are found in federal regulations from EPA that impose enforceable limits under the Clean Water Act on various surface water bodies. That comes from Section 303C of the Clean Water Act. And these are the California Toxics Rule and National Toxics Rule criteria. But they also use the term criteria to apply to those numbers that come out of the 304A process under the Clean Water Act. And these are the advisory levels to states and tribes called the National Recommended Water Quality Criteria or National Ambient Water Quality Criteria. The intent of these numbers is to help states and tribes determine whether they're in compliance with their narrative water quality objectives for toxicity primarily, and also to help states have a foundation for developing their own water quality standards. EPA will not challenge a state in adopting a state water quality standard that equals the 304A criteria. Okay. In fact, EPA has added a recent requirement that whenever there is a 304A criterion, within a certain number of years, the states who have delegated authority must have an enforceable water quality objective or enforceable criterion for that particular pollutant, or they'll promulgate themselves is the threat. So if the state doesn't act, EPA can step in. Water quality objectives. California term under Porter Cologne, limits for constituents or characteristics of water to protect beneficial uses. We find them in our water quality control plans and basin plans. We apply them to groundwater and surface water to protect beneficial uses. They have the same legal status as Clean Water Act Section 303C criteria, the promulgated criteria. They have the force and effect of regulation. Okay? So 303C, regulatory requirements. 304A, recommended. That's the difference there. And water quality objectives are like the 303C criteria. Drinking water standards. These are adopted by the Division of Drinking Water of the State Water Board or US EPA pursuant to Safe Drinking Water Acts. They're enforceable on water purveyors, those that supply water to 15 connections or more or 25 customers or more. They apply to the water in the distribution system and at the tap, where the customers get their water. However, they become a water quality objective when they're incorporated by reference into a basin plan, usually pursuant to the chemical constituents objective, saying that waters that are designated for municipal or domestic supply must comply with all maximum contaminant levels, the drinking water standards. However, that doesn't mean there are no other water quality objectives that also apply, just because there's an MCL that applies. Okay? And we saw some of those examples earlier today. Numeric thresholds. This isn't a legal term. This is a term that I use in this class and in the staff report to refer to numeric criteria and guidelines from other agencies and organizations that are calculated to protect one or more uses of water and that we can refer to in interpreting or implementing our narrative water quality objectives, whether it be toxicity, taste or odor, chemical constituents, pesticides, whatever it might be. And then I use the term assessment threshold to refer to the most stringent applicable numeric limit that would implement all applicable water quality objectives, CTR and NTR criteria. So you look at each objective and each CTR, NTR criterion, a number for each. Of that group of numbers, the assessment threshold is the lowest one. Because if you meet that one, you've met all the requirements. And this is what the assessment unit at the State Water Board uses in order to determine if something should be added to the impaired waters list. In other words, is there a violation of any water quality standard? The assessment threshold will tell you. Water quality goals is a term that I searched for that didn't have any regulatory meaning. I just wanted to use a term for this class, for the staff report, for all the reference tools that I've provided for your use in interpreting our water quality standards. It's not a policy or a regulation. You're getting my interpretation. There are two main parts to water quality goals: training materials, including the staff report and this class, and then the online searchable database and some additional tools associated with that database. And we'll look at that in a little bit. So in the staff report, and by the way, I encourage you, after you've completed this class, if you haven't read it already, please do review the staff report. It'll cover everything that you've heard in this class with a little more detail and gives you a lot of pointers about how to use the material. So each time I put out a new edition of Water Quality Goals, I include a preface that says what's new in this version. So you can go look at the preface and see what's been added or changed or removed. There is a section that talks about how to use the online database with some examples. And then there's a long section, the majority of the text is selecting water quality goals. So it explains what water quality standards are, the various types of numeric thresholds that are found in the literature, who develops them, how they're developed. There's a discussion of risk characterization methods, and that's the toxicology primer that I gave you a little earlier with a little more detail, and all those formulas are there. Then there's a section on selecting assessment thresholds from the various numeric thresholds. In other words, which number will implement all of our standards. And there are some algorithms that help you do that in a defensible way. And we'll look at the algorithms too a little later today. So online, we have a database of numeric thresholds that you can search by chemical name, or a portion of the name, or an abbreviation for the chemical, like you could type in TCE and get trichloroethylene, or the Chemical Abstract Service Registry number. The Chemical Abstract Service does a really good service in providing a unique number for every chemical. So sometimes you call a chemical one thing and another person calls the same chemical something different. How do you know you're talking about the same chemical? Well, if it has the same Chemical Abstract Service Registry number, then you are talking about the same chemical. So it's an identifier, yet another identifier for each unique chemical. And you can search by that as well. Once you've looked up a chemical, you can find its synonyms, a description of each of the types of thresholds that are in the database. There are footnotes that provide you with additional information about each of the numbers and limitations on those numbers. There are links to all the references and descriptions of those references. Primary sources are hyperlinked, so you can go right to them. And then for the last few years, when I've been adding new thresholds to the database, I've been putting in adoption dates. So what year did that particular organization publish that number or add it to a regulation or what have you. So you know how recent that number is. The database is updated regularly. It was last updated last December, and I'm about to launch into a new update. Actually, we have somebody from the assessment unit in the Division of Water Quality who's taking over the database, and I'll start training her with this next update. And then additional tools, there's an online tutorial, there's the staff report as I mentioned. There's something called the Assessment Thresholds table. So I've run the algorithms for selecting thresholds to come up with the assessment threshold. I've run those algorithms for a number of commonly encountered chemicals and provided the results for you in a table. So it's sort of a shortcut. You don't have to look at the whole database display for a particular chemical. You can look at the assessment thresholds table and figure out which ones are more defensible numbers to use to apply our standards. You can also download all the information, the thresholds, the footnotes, the references, in a tab-delimited text format for use offline. So for example, if you wanted to compare these numbers to concentrations you found through a monitoring program, and you wanted to put them in, side by side to make that comparison, you could get the numbers this way. There's also a data dictionary that tells you which columns have what information in them. There's also a detailed list of updates. So every time I make an addition to the database, I make an entry into a Word document that then gets turned into PDFs, and every time I do a major update, I publish that PDF, and you can go back in time and figure out when was something added. And then you can also sign up for information about the Water Quality Goals system through a LIRIS email list, and there's a link to that on the Water Quality Goals page. So we're going to look at it. So we're going to switch over to the web, and we're going to go to the State Water Board homepage. This is where you find it. Water Quality Assessment is the link that you're looking for, and then a compilation of water quality goals. And there are a number of sections to this page. There's a link to the searchable database right at the beginning. There's the tutorial, how to use the database, with some examples. The staff report and training videos, so the videos from this class will appear there. There are videos there from 4 years ago, right now. The assessment threshold table that comes from the algorithms that I'll present a little later. You can download the data. You can find out what was updated when, and then questions and comments. I really welcome your comments on this information. Every now and then somebody finds an error I've made, and it's really nice to get those and make those corrections. So if you find things that are in error or you're unsure, you've got my email address there and my phone number. Give me a call, send me an email, and then also sign up for the Water Quality Goals email list if you're interested in getting updated information on a regular basis. Okay, so let's look at the searchable database. It's a very simple interface to find what you're looking for. You simply have an entry area where you can type in something. We're going to look at copper, because it gives me a number of things that I can demo for you. So you put that in and click Submit. What the search engine does is it looks through all the chemical names and the synonyms and the chemical abstract service registry numbers and finds anything where that string of characters you type match and gives you a link to those. So it came up with copper and copper cyanide. We're going to just look at copper. So what I'm going to do, one of the things you can do with this page is you can hide the left navigation bar. And that should allow me to, if I can remember how to do it, zoom in. It's like Control Plus, I think. Good. So maybe you can see it a little bit better. So this is what you get when you've found an entry in the database. So first it tells you what the chemical name is on the upper left, whether it's organic or inorganic. What's the difference between those? Organic chemicals, inorganic chemicals? Carbon. Organic chemicals are based on carbon. So inorganics are things like metals or salts, things like that don't have carbon in them. And then it gives you synonyms. In this case, the abbreviation for copper is Cu on the periodic table, and then the chemical abstract service registry number. Below that starts the table of water quality thresholds. In the first column are all the sources and reference materials. So starting with the drinking water maximum contaminant levels, the drinking water standards, notice it's a blue underlined link. You click on that and it tells you where the MCLs come from, a little bit about how they're derived, difference between primary and secondary MCLs, MCL goals, and then the references. And where the references are online, you have a hyperlink. It takes you right to the original source. So if you wanted to verify something or see if there's been an update or know a little bit more about where it came from, you can do that. So all the references for the MCLs, both state and federal, are here. So the various types of MCLs are shown following that. Ones that come from California, primary and secondary. The ones that US EPA publishes, primary, secondary, and MCL goals. And then to the right, there are two columns for the actual thresholds. The reason I have two columns is sometimes there's a number on the books, and the organization that's being referenced publishes a draft new number for public comment. So you'll see one number in threshold 1, another in threshold 2, and there'll be a footnote that tells you what the difference is between those two numbers. Okay? Or you might have two toxicology thresholds, one for adults and one for children. Or you may have a situation where it's actually a range of concentrations or a range of numeric limits, like for pH, 6.5 to 8.5 to protect aquatic life. Okay? The footnotes will always tell you the relationship between threshold 1 and threshold 2 if there are two thresholds in the database. Assume the units are micrograms per liter. If it's something different, like the EPA ambient water quality criterion for methyl mercury, which is a fish tissue number in milligrams per kilogram of fish tissue, if it's not micrograms per liter, you'll find something in this next column, the units column. There's a notes column. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then two columns for footnotes. If there's a footnote, please look at it before using those numbers. Sometimes it'll tell you, oh, this was a draft number. Or in this case, the MCL includes this action level to be exceeded in no more than 10% of samples at the tap. So that's how the drinking water regulations for copper are worded, just so you know how that applies. So two columns for footnotes. Please do read them. They are hyperlinks. Adoption dates are then in the next column. And the last two columns have to do with the algorithms that we'll go through. So you have first a column that talks about the different narrative objectives that you might have to comply with. CC for chemical constituents, CT for chemical toxicity. The last column tells you what kind of water body it might be used for. It's G for groundwater, IS for inland surface waters, E for enclosed bays or estuary, O for ocean waters. And we'll look more at that when we look at the algorithms. So going down the table, as I mentioned, we have the MCLs first, both state and federal. Public health goals are next. Notification levels, remember those are the numbers that are published by the Drinking Water Program for chemicals that don't yet have an MCL, but for which they're concerned might be elevated in some drinking water systems.
John?
Yes.
How come there's no adoption date for the secondary MCL and both?
How come there's no adoption dates for the secondary MCL? Because that's been on the books longer than I started adding adoption dates to the database. And I haven't found my minions to go back and fill those in for me.
Gotcha. And should there not be I mean, the footnote 1 only applies to the primary MCL, so there is no footnote for the secondary. Just curious. I'm assuming if there is no footnote, then there.
If there is no footnote, then I don't have any additional thing to say other than what the numbers are. And you can find out more about those, where they come from and how they're derived by clicking on one of the topic links. So if there's something specific about that threshold that's different than normal, then I'll throw a footnote in. Good question. Thanks for asking. Okay, so then we have the drinking water health advisories. They used to be called suggested no adverse response levels, or SNARLs, and these are for non-cancer health effects. Cancer risk thresholds at the 1 in a million cancer risk level, those that come from the Cal EPA OEHA Cancer Potency Factor Database, EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, the health advisories, and National Academy of Sciences Drinking Water and Health. You see the same progress of different types of references under the health advisories as well, with the exception of Cal EPA doesn't publish the non-cancer numbers in their Cancer Potency Factor Database. Then the Prop 65 safe harbor numbers. These are the no significant risk level for carcinogens and the maximum allowable dose level for reproductive toxins. Again, remember that those are based differently. They're calculated using different factors than just about all the other criteria from other agencies that you'll see. Notice here for the cancer risk areas that I've got some letter-based footnotes. D, Class D in the carcinogen list. In other words, Class D, if you remember, is those substances for which we don't have enough information about cancer risk. Okay. 68 usually almost always means draft, but you can click it to find out. Draft, tentative, provisional. Okay. Heading on down the table, taste and odor thresholds. Agricultural water quality goals from that Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN publication. You can see here's that number 200 for ag use. And then we have the CTR and NTR criteria. I've combined them into a single area. If it's an NTR criterion rather than a CTR, there'll be a footnote that tells you that. But in most cases, they're CTR. So we have for inland surface waters, the human health values, those that are based on drinking the water plus eating fish for MUN waters, and those that are based on just eating fish for waters that are not municipal or domestic supply. And then the aquatic life protective CTR criteria, the 4-day average chronic number, the 1-hour average acute toxicity number, and some of them are expressed as maxima, instantaneous maxima. You don't see a level here for copper. But notice on the aquatic life criteria, if you go to the right, there's an entry in the notes column. It says see page 23. That designation is that page number designation is a holdover from when this used to actually be a published manual that came out every 6 or 8 months that got too cumbersome to keep updating. But what you get when you click on that is it downloads an Excel table for you. And if you recall when we talked about copper and aquatic life, copper criteria vary with the hardness of the water. Well, you don't have to make any of the calculations. They're all done for you, and they're graphed. So this table, let me enlarge a little bit. Okay, so we have various hardness values. Milligrams per liter as calcium carbonate is how the hardness is expressed. And the criteria are expressed two different ways, either as dissolved copper or total recoverable copper. And there are standard factors that are used to calculate between those two ways of expressing them. And then, as I mentioned before, we've got a continuous concentration, the chronic tox values for aquatic life, and the acute maximum concentrations, the 1 hour average. So you'll find those under both dissolved and total recoverable. Notice that under 25 milligrams per liter hardness, the instruction from EPA is to use the formula and actually calculate it. So if you needed to do that, just grab one of these other numbers, and let's say our hardness was 15. Just type that in, hit enter. The criteria to the right will recalculate for you based on that new hardness value. So you don't need to run any of the calculations yourself because they can be kind of complicated. Give you an idea. There's the formulas. Okay. So if you did need to run them, you've got those too. When we get to very high hardness values, the relationship between toxicity and hardness breaks down. So EPA says above 400 milligrams per liter as calcium carbonate for hardness. We're just going to stick with the 400 criteria. Okay. So then all of these values are also graphed out for you. Let me run this. So you can see how they vary with hardness, both the dissolved and the total recoverable, and then for each, the acute and the chronic values. And if there are some limitations on the use of the CTR or NTR criteria, I put those in a note. And then, as I mentioned, the formulas are at the top of the graph. And at the very top, it tells you whether you're looking at California Toxics Rule, National Toxics Rule, or EPA's recommended water quality criteria. That will be in the header. Any questions about variation with hardness? Yes?
So in the permits I've seen in Region 9, we tend to just put the equation as our water quality objective and require people to calculate or to sample for the hardness. So we don't give them a fixed number.
Right. The question is, so in Region 9 in our permits, we put in the formula and let the discharger calculate the criterion on the fly based on what the hardness was when they sampled for copper. Some regions do it that way. Some regions put a table in their permits, like the table you have here on the left. Other regions look at what is the lowest hardness that they expect might occur at different times of the year and put actual solid numbers in. You got to comply with this number during the winter months when there's more flow, and during other times you have to comply with this other number. So it's done, there's not a consistent way in which it's done from region to region and discharge the discharge. But the idea is you're going to comply with this in some way, shape, or form. And for some of the less sophisticated dischargers, having them calculate the limits on the fly might be a little too complicated. Definitely the larger municipal dischargers can do that. But they actually don't have to do it. They can just use my table. This is on the public site, by the way. Yes?
So if an entity is applying for a grant, say, they could use these numbers to estimate?
So if an entity is applying for a grant to do what?
To, say, improve water quality.
Okay. How much improvement would be necessary? This could help them. any of these numbers that I'm showing you could be used to figure out what are my targets for that kind of a remedial action.
And is this the best go-to place for them?
It's an easy place to find a lot of numbers.
Are there better numbers around that they would find that we would know about?
Probably not. About the only other place that I might look is if you have a constituent that has no recommended criteria or promulgated criteria or thresholds in the literature. You might have to go to the EcoTox database and see, could it affect aquatic life? Some of the emerging constituents of emerging concern, like pharmaceuticals, you might need to go to that database or some other places in the literature to find out, well, what is a toxic amount? Because we don't have published values from EPA or other agencies. So sometimes you have to do a little more digging. But if it's in here, you've got quite a bit of information to work with. Okay, moving on. So also in the CTR, we have criteria for enclosed bays and estuaries. This looks at the human health protection from eating fish only, not drinking the water because it's normally too brackish to drink. And then the saltwater aquatic life protection numbers are here. Realize, though, that if you're in that medium range of salinity, you've got to look at both freshwater and saltwater aquatic life criteria and apply them more stringent. Then, following that, we leave the CTR and come to our ocean waters. The California Toxics Rule and the National Toxics Rule do not apply to ocean waters. So that's waters of California waters that's 3 miles offshore are our waters. And instead, we have a statewide water quality control plan adopted by the State Water Board called the California Ocean Plan. And it has numerical water quality objectives that apply to protecting human health and aquatic life in those waters. So essentially that substitutes for CTR and NTR in those waters. As you can see, there's a human health protective area here. There isn't one for copper in this case because that's not most limiting. Human health protective criteria, many of them are expressed on a 30-day average, and that's how it's done in the ocean plan. And then the marine life protection criteria are published in a variety of averaging periods, from instantaneous maximum all the way to 6-month median. So whichever ones apply to that particular constituent you're looking at, you'll see the entries there. In this case, a footnote of 2 expressed as total recoverable. Some are expressed as total recoverable, some as dissolved. You see a footnote 1 for dissolved. But just click on the footnote to find out what it says. Then we have EPA's National Recommended Water Quality Criteria. So these are the ones that are advisory to states and tribes to help them with calculating their own standards or for interpreting their narratives. So human health protective for water and fish consumption or fish consumption only. Got both public health effects that don't involve cancer and cancer risk estimates. And then taste or odor. If there is a taste and odor threshold, organoleptic is what they call it, that's lower than the toxic threshold, they will publish that too. So in the case of copper, they've indicated that at 1,000 ppb, you might have adverse tastes or odors from copper, and it's still not toxic to humans until 1,300. In the case of the freshwater aquatic life protective criteria for copper, EPA has now come up with something more complicated than just a comparison with hardness. There are a number of factors in water that can affect the toxicity of copper and other metals, not just hardness. And the EPA has published something called the biotic ligand model, which allows you to calculate protective criteria based on about 10 different factors of water quality factors. So that's what this footnote 180 takes you to. They've only published that so far for copper. There are some dischargers that would like to use it for other metals, but EPA doesn't recommend that yet. But that's the direction that their ambient water quality criteria are going for metals, is this a modeling of multiple factors. One of the problems with that, though, is you have to make sure that if you took a copper sample, you've also not just sampled for hardness, but for all these other factors like dissolved organic carbon and pH and all these other things. So it gets more complicated in the monitoring, and you have to have a lot more data in order to find out, am I in compliance or not? Question?
Yes, regarding the taste and odor or welfare, do you think that welfare is meaning staining?
Welfare could mean staining of the laundry. So the question is, what is taste and odor or welfare? What does the welfare part mean? Taste and odor is part of welfare, but also laundry staining is one of the things that can be a factor. Yeah. Okay. Then we have freshwater and saltwater aquatic life criteria, different averaging periods depending on how they were published. If EPA doesn't have enough data to calculate recommended criteria, we don't have that 8 families of organisms, both vertebrates and invertebrates, and hopefully an aquatic plant or two, then they will publish what are the limiting acute, chronic, and other toxicology values when they publish their criteria documents. So you'll find some entries for some of the chemicals in these toxicity information rows, not for copper because they actually have recommended criteria. Realize that some of those are rather old. You're better off going to the EcoTox database to get the brand new stuff. And then our saltwater protective aquatic life criteria follow that. And that's the end of the table. Then there are some footnotes. So I've done some of the calculations for you, those toxicology calculations, and I put the assumptions in here as notes. So you know whether I use, what values I used for body weight, how much consumption, relative source contribution, those kinds of things. Okay? All right. And then also all the abbreviations that are used in the right 2 columns for limiting thresholds. We'll look at those a little bit later. And then if you were to print this page out, all the footnotes that are cited are spelled out here at the very bottom. So you could print this out and have all the information from the database for copper or any other chemical you wanted to look up.
And so why would somebody use this?
Why would somebody use this? Because they're trying to find out what concentration of copper or whatever substance they're looking for would impair a beneficial use of water. What might be a problem for aquatic life, what might be a problem for human health, what might violate certain regulatory thresholds. That's what this database is all about.
Site cleanup consultants.
Absolutely. Site cleanup is a big user of these. So permit writers that want to find out, well, I'm going to calculate an effluent limit, but what does that have to be based on not exceeding in the receiving water? So all kinds of uses. Virtually all of our programs at the boards can use this information. Any questions about what's in the database? Okay, I'm going to go back to the page again, just to run down again what is found here, because some of you came in a little bit late, and I indicated at the beginning of the class you really don't need to take notes because it's all here. So we already looked at the searchable database. There is some language in bold red text that makes our attorneys happy, that this is not statute or regulation. Also, how recent the database was updated is cited here. And then some red bold text that makes me happy. Don't use the numbers until you've either taken the class or read the staff report to really understand what they're all about. Don't just grab numbers without knowing what they mean, what they're for, and how they might be used in your work. And then, whoops, sorry about that. The staff report is here, so all of the text that describes what's in this class is repeated in the staff report, plus a little bit more information. And then the course videos, the PowerPoint slides from this class, the course agenda are all here. And then the assessment threshold table, we'll look at that a little bit later. And then the downloads, the threshold tables, the footnotes, the references, the data dictionary, and then all the updates that have happened since August of 2003, when I started tracking that. And then questions or comments. You can send me an email, you can call me, and then you can sign up for the LIRIS email list. So any questions about what's online? Okay. I'm the only one updating this. So 20% of my time supposedly is devoted to this and teaching the classes, but actually it winds up to be about 5% of my time, because there's other things that need to get done. All right, let's go back to, so I mentioned that I've developed some algorithms that help you select from all those numbers that are in the database in a more defensible manner. So to be defensible, numeric thresholds should be chosen to implement each applicable water quality objective or promulgated water quality criterion. You can't pick and choose which ones to comply with. You have to comply with them all. So let's develop a number for each one, and then the assessment threshold is the most limiting of those numbers. So in the algorithms, there are 3 main steps. The first step is selecting a single numeric threshold to satisfy each applicable water quality objective and promulgated criterion or relevant portion thereof. I'll get to relevant portion a little bit later. Well, as an example, toxicity. Is it aquatic life? Is it human health? Is it plants? Those might be different portions of the toxicity objective. And then the second step is to satisfy all the objectives and criteria, select the lowest threshold from those you selected in step 1. That's your assessment threshold. And then compare with natural background if that's an issue and adjust upward to the natural background level. And that's only going to happen in certain places like where there's naturally high arsenic or a few other things like that. It's going to be pretty rare that you have to deal with that. Okay. So as I mentioned, don't just open the database and find the lowest number and say, oh, that's what I'm going to use, because it might not be appropriate to what you're trying to do. Make sure you're aware that some of these numbers are promulgated. What's in the ocean plan is a regulation. What's in the CTR or the NTR is a regulation. It has more legal weight than interpreting a narrative objective with a recommended number from somebody else. And the algorithms take that into consideration. So in defensibility, again, avoid arbitrary selection of numbers. Carefully document the numbers that you've selected and why you selected them. Cite the original references. Where did they come from? What organization? What document? Don't just say, I got them out of water quality goals, because that's just a secondary reference. Go to the primary references. And then you may have case-specific information. For example, in the Santa Ana region, their basin plan for toxicity, the toxicity objective for groundwater says that where we have an MCL, we're going to default to that being protective of human health. Well, that's a decision that they've made, that their board has adopted. So we're not going to look at other human toxicity issues in Region 8 if there's an MCL. So you need to know what's specific to the case, the region in the basin plan, what are the particular beneficial uses you're trying to protect. So these are some limitations that will come from knowing more about the case. So the same number isn't going to apply everywhere. Okay. So remember, step 1, we're going to look at each water quality objective and CTR or NTR criterion and select a number. First of all, is the numeric threshold relevant? Check the intent of the threshold. What is it trying to protect? Does what it's trying to protect match the language of the narrative objective? Is it a toxicity threshold? Is it a taste and odor threshold? Is it something protective of agricultural use? Is it appropriate for what you're trying to use? Part of that has to do with checking exposure routes if you're looking at toxicity. So we're talking exposure to humans through eating fish and drinking the water, or just drinking the water. What are the exposure routes? Is it suitable for the beneficial use that you're trying to protect? There's a preference in the algorithms for purely risk-based numeric thresholds rather than risk management-based thresholds. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about, a purely risk-based threshold for toxicity might be a toxic amount. A risk management-based threshold might be an MCL that has been, they started with a toxic value, but then made some adjustments based on what's needed for the drinking water implementation program. Okay? Some of those adjustments may not be relevant to what you're trying to do, and I showed you some examples earlier on that. So toxicity-based thresholds instead of MCLs is a preference when you're implementing the toxicity objective. And again, because the risk management-based thresholds like MCLs may contain irrelevant information or constraints, outdated analytical quantitation limits, constraints imposed by another agency or organization's regulatory scheme, like the drinking water program. There's also a preference for California numbers when they're available to be consistent internally within California government. So if there's a disagreement in cancer risk thresholds between OEHA and US EPA, and we're talking about two recommended numbers, there's a preference in the algorithm for those published by OEHA, our sister Cal EPA agency. Okay. And then make sure the numbers that you select reflect peer-reviewed science. They're either from peer-reviewed journal articles or they're from final published documents rather than drafts. And the footnotes will tell you. Also make sure that the thresholds that you use reflect current science. This is where the adoption dates come in handy. If you're looking at two different cancer risk levels or whatever it might be from different organizations, well, which one is newer? If one is substantially newer than the other one, you're probably better off using that. Okay, so how frequently criteria thresholds are updated by the organizations they come from is factored into the algorithms. So the first two algorithms that I put together were for groundwater and inland surface waters. This is when I worked for the Central Valley Board, and we didn't have to worry about enclosed bays and estuaries or ocean waters in the Central Valley region. But then I came to the State Water Board, and in the 16th edition of Water Quality Goals, I added two more algorithms. There are certain beneficial uses that require more limiting protectiveness than others. They will wind up being the ones that determine what your assessment threshold winds up being. So for groundwater, it's usually municipal and domestic supply concerns as well as agricultural supply. For inland surface waters, those two are important, but then you also have aquatic life protection. And in addition, you've got fish and shellfish consumption to consider, bioaccumulation in the food web. For enclosed bays and estuaries, you have aquatic life protection and fish and shellfish consumption, but there's no water consumption and no ag use because the water is too saline usually. For ocean waters, same situation. Aquatic life protection, fish and shellfish consumption, but no water consumption and no ag use. Now there's a situation that we've recently come upon with desalination that may turn this on its head, because we're looking at taking ocean waters or other brackish waters and removing the salt and providing that to people as drinking water. So we might need to be looking at, well, what other chemical constituents might be there that might impact that beneficial use. So we may have to add back some of these limiting uses in the case of desal. Haven't gotten there yet in these algorithms. But just know the algorithms aren't foolproof. You have to think. Okay. And when we're looking at aquatic life protection, use the inland surface waters algorithm where the salinity is less than 10 parts per thousand. Use the enclosed bays and estuaries algorithm when the salinity is greater than 1 part per thousand. But notice there's an overlap. You'll be running two algorithms when you're in between 1 and 10 parts per thousand salinity, because you may have both freshwater and saltwater aquatic life present. Okay, the groundwater algorithm. We're going to look at each of the types of things that you have to comply with. So narrative objectives, numeric thresholds that have been promulgated. So we'll start with the chemical constituents objective. The way that the algorithms work is it's an outline. You run down the outline in order and select a number as instructed by the outline every time you have an arrow-shaped bullet. If you open the Water Quality Goals staff report, all the outlines are there for each of the algorithms for you to follow. I'm going to go through a summary of what you find there. So if you're actually going to run the algorithms, open the staff report, go to that chapter, and run down the list. So every time I come to an arrow-shaped bullet, I'm going to write down a number. So the first thing you're going to do is open your basin plan and find out, do I have a numeric water quality objective? If I do, I'm going to write that down. If the water is designated municipal or domestic supply, do I have an MCL, a primary MCL, a secondary MCL? If I have both, you got to comply with both. Write the more stringent one down. If you have other indications of beneficial use impairment, such as agricultural thresholds, or a federal MCL that's more stringent than a California primary MCL. Don't have to worry about that one right now, but it might appear in the future. You'd take the lowest of those two and you'd write that one down as well. Then we go to toxicity. So the kind of toxicity we're concerned about in groundwater is drinking water health-based limits. And the different kinds of limits are listed here in a hierarchy. So you're going to start running down the list, and once you find one, you're going to stop, because they're preference for California values that are frequently updated, that consider as many exposure pathways as are relevant for domestic and municipal use of water in the home. So OEHA's public health goals are at the top because they're reviewed and updated every 5 years. They're from a sister Cal EPA agency, and they, in the case of volatile organics, consider more exposure pathways than other limits based on water use in the home. Yes, question?
So the water sampling for groundwater, is that conducted by all these agencies as well?
The question is the sampling of groundwater conducted by all these agencies? No, it is not. And we're not going to get into sampling because that's a whole other class. But many of these agencies do collect water samples. For example, when I get to it, the notification levels from the State Water Board Division of Drinking Water, they require source water assessments for all the drinking water sources. So they will do some groundwater sampling. The State Water Board Groundwater Ambient Monitoring and Assessment Program, GAMA, they also do groundwater sampling. The Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program of the State Water Board collects surface water samples to see whether there are beneficial uses that are impaired. So a lot of these organizations do collect samples, some do not. OEHA is not a sample collection agency. Okay? But they might look at samples collected by the Department of Fish and Wildlife for surface waters or fish tissue. Okay, so public health goals are the first. If you have one, you write that down, you stop with the toxicity objective. If you don't have one there, then you next would look at Cal EPA's cancer potency factors at the 1 in a million risk level. If there's not a number there, you drop down to the notification levels, and then we leave the California system. The next best is IRIS. EPA maintains that IRIS contains the most current, up-to-date information on toxic thresholds for human health protection of all of their data systems. So IRIS would be next. If there's nothing there, EPA's health advisories. They're not updated as often, and that's why they have a lower hierarchy. And then MCL goals, if they're non-zero MCL goals for non-cancer health effects, would be next. Again, because those aren't updated very often. And then if you still have nothing, you might look at the National Academy of Sciences, drinking water and health, cancer and non-cancer health effects numbers. They're rather old. But you may have nothing else to rely on. And then the Prop 65 safe harbor levels, again, if you have nothing else to rely on. Taste and odor, again, a hierarchy. We're starting this time with the secondary MCLs from the California Drinking Water Program, as long as it wasn't altered by cost or technology factors. In other words, it's a risk-based number rather than a risk management-based number. For most secondary MCLs, they've not been adjusted based on technological or economic factors. They're purely human welfare protective. Federal MCLs would be next. And then if you don't find numbers in either of those, The National Recommended Water Quality Criteria will give you an organoleptic threshold if that is lower than the toxicity numbers. Make sure that it's an organoleptic threshold in water, not in fish tissue, because we're dealing with groundwater. And then other taste noted thresholds from the peer-reviewed literature. So each algorithm gives you a summary table that as you're going down the outline, every time you hit an arrow-shaped bullet, you're going to write something down, and you can record those in a sample table that I have given here. Once you've filled that out, step 2 of the algorithm, select the lowest number from this table. That will implement all of these requirements. And then step 3, adjust for natural background upward if natural background is higher than the number you selected in step 2. Any questions about how the groundwater algorithm works? Okay. Inland surface waters. We're not going to go through the whole algorithm. I'm going to give you a flavor for what's different in this one than the groundwater algorithm. We have additional beneficial uses to protect: aquatic life, fish and shellfish consumption. We also have promulgated water quality criteria from EPA, the CTR and the NTR. Those being promulgated have greater legal weight than using a recommended criterion to do the same thing. In other words, if I have a CTR criterion for cadmium to protect aquatic life, and I have EPA's national recommended water quality criteria to protect aquatic life from cadmium, the CTR number has greater legal weight. It will hold up better in court. That's what you're going to pick. In the case of cadmium, that's a problem, because EPA's newer information that's in the national recommended criteria indicates that fish are a lot more sensitive to cadmium than we thought. We're stuck with the CTR and NTR numbers because they were promulgated to protect that beneficial use specifically until we revise with a new statewide water quality objective. And there's an effort afoot to adopt a statewide objective for cadmium that will mimic EPA's newer recommended criteria. Until that's done, you're stuck with the promulgated number. Yes?
Since it's promulgated, does that mean the US EPA or California has to review and do the next too?
Promulgated means that the number exists in regulation, not just a recommendation. Okay? So it has the force and effect of law for protecting that beneficial use in that body of water.
And it sounded like you had said, though, EPA pushed that upon the California by wanting...
The California Toxics Rule was promulgated by EPA because they were tired of waiting for California to get its act together.
Okay.
Right?
So we're going to be... And so why...
There are two ways you can update those. Either EPA can publish a new one through a regulation revision process, or the state of California can adopt one and get EPA to approve it.
Okay.
Right.
And that's the... until that happens.
Until that happens, we are stuck with what's in the CTR and the NTR.
And you still have the dischargers challenging some of the improvements on that, sounds like?
They're always involved. The dischargers are always involved anytime we want to change a regulation that might affect how they're regulated. Yes, they speak up. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do in the algorithm for inland surface waters is look at the California Toxics Rule and the National Toxics Rule criteria. You've got a human health protective number to pick, and you have to look to see whether it's municipal or domestic supply water to know whether you have the water plus fish consumption or just the fish consumption number that applies. If it's not MUN, just use the fish consumption number. We also have aquatic life protective numbers. In this case, you've got to write them both down because we have to protect against both chronic and acute toxicity to aquatic organisms. Usually a 4-day average for chronic, a 1-hour average for acute. So you're going to write those numbers down. Then for chemical constituents, we're going to look to see if we have a numeric water quality objective from the basin plan. It may supersede the CTR or NTR criterion if EPA has approved it. If EPA hasn't approved it, then you pick the lowest between CTR and the objective adopted by the state or regional water board. The chemical constituents objective requires compliance with drinking water MCLs for waters designated municipal or domestic supply. It's done the same way as the groundwater algorithm. Look at the primary and the secondary and the lowest of those two. And then other thresholds indicating beneficial use impairment, agricultural use, and then EPA MCLs being more stringent. Don't have to worry about that last one, but this is where the ag use numbers would come in. Toxicity objective. We have different pathways to consider now. Not just drinking the water, but also eating fish and shellfish from the water. So let's separate those out because they're handled differently. So drinking water health-based thresholds, you use those if you have no other CTR or NTR human health criteria. And if you don't have CTR or NTR, it's the same as the groundwater algorithm. If we're looking at human health, including fish consumption, you look at EPA's national recommended water quality criteria if you don't have a promulgated CTR or NTR human health protective criterion. Water and fish consumption for municipal or domestic supplies, fish consumption only for non-municipal or domestic supply waters. Is that clear? Okay. But under toxicity, we also have to protect aquatic life in our inland surface waters. So we have aquatic life protective thresholds. If there's no CTR or NTR aquatic life criteria, then you'd start with those that are calculated by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Those are mainly pesticides. Nothing there, then you look at EPA's national recommended water quality criteria. 2 averaging periods, 4-day average, 1-hour average. There may be some slight variations in the averaging periods. You got to protect against both acute and chronic toxicity, so you'd write those both down. Again, you do those if you don't have a CTR or NTR criterion that does the same thing. Taste and odor, it's the same as the groundwater algorithm, but something that taints fish flesh is also relevant here. So if we have EPA national recommended water quality criteria based on the taste or odor that's imparted to fish tissue, we'd want to include that here. We wouldn't include that in the groundwater algorithm. So again, step 1, you select a number for each arrow-shaped bullet, and there's a figure on page 33 of the staff report to use to help you record those. Step 2, select the lowest of those numbers to satisfy all applicable objectives, and then adjust for natural background if necessary. So here's what the table looks like. It's a little more complicated than the groundwater algorithm table because there are a lot more things to consider. Okay, so you'd run through the algorithm and write down numbers as you go, and then pick the lowest of those as your assessment threshold. Enclosed bays and estuaries. It's fairly similar to the inland surface waters algorithm in that we have CTR and NTR criteria, I should put a different word in there, that invalidate the use of narrative toxicity recommended criteria. It's different, however, from the inland surface waters algorithm in that there's no municipal or domestic supply use. The water is normally too saline. And the human health criteria are limited to fish and shellfish consumption, no direct consumption of the water. No ag use either. Aquatic life criteria, check the salinity. If you're in an enclosed bay or estuary, is the salinity in that range between 1 and 10 parts per thousand, where you need to look at both saltwater aquatic life criteria and freshwater aquatic life criteria. So, and then here's the table that you would use in order to record the results of running through that algorithm. Again, the algorithms are all printed out for you in the staff report. The last one, ocean waters. It's similar to enclosed bays and estuaries in that human health criteria are limited to fish and shellfish consumption, but it's different in that, first of all, CTR and NTR don't apply. But instead, we have the ocean plan. And those are promulgated water quality objectives in regulation. They have more legal weight than recommended criteria. Okay? And then the saltwater aquatic life protective criteria are used instead of the freshwater. And here's the table that you'd use to run through that algorithm. So you don't have to run through these algorithms for a lot of things you currently encounter in your work. I've done it for you, and I'll show you that. That's the assessment thresholds table. There was, first of all, a question over here.
Yeah, my question was, so I see, so I kind of figured out the difference is also, it sounds like a little bit more about drinking water versus regional water boards. Well, is you guys are focusing more on discharge results?
We're looking at the quality of water in the source water to the drinking water system.
Correct.
Think of it that way.
Exactly.
So that's a really good overlap. That's a good question. So difference between drinking water and water quality programs, they actually have a big overlap, and that's source water assessment. So all the water utilities are required to find out what's in the source water that they're grabbing their water from, and what potentially contaminating activities might there be upstream that could affect the quality of those source waters.
Exactly.
So the data that are generated by our ambient water quality monitoring programs would be very useful to those running source water assessment.
Yeah, no kidding. And I was just thinking, I mean, you guys definitely provide a great service. It's always been something I kind of joked with when I went to college, because the Southern California people get a lot of our wastewater at the end of the day. I mean, that was something I would always give them a hard time about. But the one thing I found interesting is in water quality goals, being that they do kind of drive regional discharge limits more than they drive division drinking water limits. Granted, they do overlap.
There's an overlap,
A
yes.
substantial overlap. But there is no real groundwater injection. I mean, that's illegal as far as I know for discharge.
So how would this apply to groundwater injection?
Yeah, just because I was under the impression that there was no groundwater injection.
There is groundwater injection. There are a number of places where water is being injected in the subsurface for storage. There are other places where wastewater is being discharged through injection into aquifers that are not sources of water supply for disposal purposes. And those are both regulated activities.
And so how would you then relate the discharged water and groundwater that's being sampled and it going through the soil and actually being back deposited into the aquifer? I would imagine there's I don't know, I'm probably getting too technical here, but I was thinking just there's a lot of work to, right now Sigma's being developed. It's gonna be very
Again, you're getting into an area where there's a lot of effort going on to how do you calculate whether a discharge of wastewater or water into the subsurface is going to cause a problem or not. And the main thing we're trying to figure out in those cases is, would we violate any water quality objective in that receiving groundwater by doing that injection? If so, we probably need to put limits on what they can inject, how much, what the concentrations might be, in order to protect those uses of groundwater. So it's sort of a similar kind of thing as discharges to surface waters. You're looking at what standards need to be met in the receiving water, and what do I need to do about the discharge to prevent those from being exceeded. Okay. All right, so the assessment thresholds table. I'll show you where it is again on the Water Quality Goals webpage. And again, it's for commonly encountered constituents and parameters. The algorithm tables have all been filled in for you, but it's one combined table. Groundwater, inlet surface waters, enclosed bays and estuaries, and ocean waters. But there is a column that tells you in the table which of those types of waters those numbers would apply to. G, I, S, E, or O. And they're designed, again, to protect those more limiting beneficial uses that tend to drive the selection of assessment thresholds. So before we take a break. So again, you're back on the Water Quality Goals webpage. Water quality-based assessment thresholds. And there it is there, assessment thresholds table. So again, it's an Excel spreadsheet. Every browser handles Excel tables a little differently. All right, I'm going to blow this up so you can really see it. Let's go here. And let's go to the top. Well, first of all, there is, let me zoom back a second. There's some red bold text at the top that tells you one of the limitations of this table. It doesn't include numeric water quality objectives from each of the basin plans. Those vary from place to place, region to region. You need to look those up separately. But everything else is here that goes into the algorithms. Let me zoom in again. Okay. So in the first column, the constituent or parameter of interest is listed. In the next column, the water quality objective or promulgated criterion that would be satisfied, that needs to be satisfied. The source of a numeric threshold that could be used in a defensible way to apply that water quality objective or promulgated criterion. So where it comes from, what the threshold is itself, and what its units are. And then the column that tells you whether that would apply to groundwater, inland surface waters, enclosed bay, or estuary. Sometimes a number applies in multiple places, and that tells you. And then there are a series of columns that look at the more limiting beneficial uses and put an X in the box where that's probably the most limiting number you're going to need to deal with if these are the uses you're trying to protect. And then finally, the Chemical Abstract Service registry number at the far right. Okay, so if you're looking at finding numbers for chemicals, start here, because a lot of the homework's done for you. If the chemical of interest is not here, and this gets updated every time the database does, if it's not here, then go back to the database and run through the algorithm that's for the water body type that you're looking at. Okay. Questions about that? All right. So it's time for a break. Let's do that.